I've always thought governance is an extremely slippery or broad sort of topic. So the way we're using the term is to think about the way governing bodies and society more broadly make decisions. But in particular, we're asking Peter to think about agility within the public sector and Jane to think about the way you engage beyond the public sector in order to engender agility and effectiveness of governance.
When I read up on this at the end of last week, having been asked to do an element of it, I thought, well, the best bit I know about is agility and adaptation in the public sector, because many of you may know, but I've done, I think this is my 5th CEO job in the public sector, and I've been in so many different departments I couldn't count them, and I've done a bit of work outside the private sector as well. So let me tell you this for a start. So sophisters, economists and calculators, according to Edmund Burke, is what we now have in our society. Actually, that's Edmund Burke from 1790, following the French Revolution. I'm giving you that as an intro because I'm in the middle. I'm really happy to be the one in the middle, because if the alternatives are to be one of the two on the end, I don't think I really want to be that. So I'm going to offer you something which is a bit of a perspective, obviously driven by my background. So I have economics as a background, which is why I chair the Productivity Commission, amongst other things. So my take on agility and effectiveness in the public sector is one which is about adapting to change. And I think it's relevant to today's public sector, primarily because so many of us have faced change in the public sector in recent times with changes of government. So here's my version of the agile public servant, the equivalent of the US mountain goat. There was a thing on Channel 10, by total coincidence, on Saturday night, there was a thing on mountain goats, and almost this mountain goat, I think, maybe not, maybe a very photogenic mountain goat. This one came, of course, from Google Pictures, but I'm using the mountain goat for agility as a model here. We should have a role model. The North American mountain goat is tough and independent and occupies the high moral ground as its natural home. That's us. And it can jump from cliff to cliff without too much drama. Of course, it's food for a variety of predators, and that may be something we can identify with as well. And its natural homeland has certainly shrunk a lot in recent times. Its numbers are falling, and we can identify a bit with that. As one of my colleagues said, it should learn to duck like us. So we know the environment is changing in the public sector, and we know that community expectations for all the work we do are for much better service from all of us. And we know that media expectations are for brilliant anticipation on behalf of all of us and fault-free implementation. We know that we're surrounded by people who are improving compliance standards on us all the time, not just the Auditor General, but finance regulations and FOI and Senate estimates and merit protection and management of bullying and harassment and all of the things that tests to which we are held accountable over time. And there's a presumption that all risks can be managed, which of course is utter rubbish. And there's an assessment that no failure is too small to ever go unpunished. So this is the environment in which we are all currently working. In that environment, one of your better friends, I will argue to you today, is transparency. Now, I'm going to tell you the negatives here, of course, about transparency first, then I'm going to tell you the positives. And I'm going to tell you why I think transparency is of great benefit to us in the cause of change. So obviously the negatives in transparency, and this goes on with the accountability theme, everything we do is recorded, nothing's unrecoverable. Oral clearance is irrelevant nowadays. In terms of compliance, there's no hope for redemption if you've only got oral permission to do anything. History is going to be rewritten by the victors. In the Commonwealth at the moment, we have potential for judicial inquiries into the actions that you undertook for the previous government. And participation in the online world means your private life is now a risk factor in your professional work life. We have at the Commonwealth level no IPAA yet, but basically at state government level, we all know what that means. I've worked for the Victorian government as well. There's a sort of IPAA thing starting up there, but as we all know. So these are the mechanisms of transparency that surround us. And like the mountain goat, you need to know the difference between the ranger and the hunter. So you actually have compliance people working around you all the time, and that knowledge can save your own life, as with the mountain goat. Expectations. The other thing that's altering in our environment around us is expectations. The dead bodies of old governments litter the landscape. The new ones have, as always, a great deal of difficulty making their expectations clear to us. They have those expectations, but they can't really, a lot of the time, articulate them because they are so many and varied, and there's a good potential for changing them, and we're not naturally the sort of people that they're going to share them with. But because they have them, we need to help them make their expectations clear, or we risk, like the mountain goat, straying outside a boundary and getting shot. Waiting to be told of those expectations is not the way to gain clarity. So my first commentary here is that leaders, and this includes people like me, but surrounding you and for upwards management purposes, leaders need to take risks in search of clues for what the expectations of governments really are. And in adaptation, we're sure to get new rules imposed as we deal with new governments, but a bit of guidance can help as well. So I'm sort of okay with rules, but I think guidance is going to be far more effective. We need a practical strategy for handling a new world. And the practical strategy when governments change and public servants need to learn again how to be agile, that is how to handle the new government's expectations, I think, is to go back to basics. So this what, when, how, who, how much thing is just a standard design plan for any strategy. And the things that will knock you over is the core element of that. What risks do you need to manage and what can destroy you, what can knock you off course? And in designing this thing, you can't have any single tool. We need to be able to adapt to utilising multiple tools, which means things that you've had in your past experience that you may have jettisoned probably need to be brought back to mind in dealing with new governments. And we need to ask why. It's one thing I've always done with people as I've changed jobs, is to tell them the first thing I want to offer them when you work for me is the ability to ask why. And I think our leaders need to actually restore the permission to ask why. They need to ask why of their ministers in terms of change. We need to be allowed, those of us who are at less than the leadership level need to be allowed to ask why too, simply because you can't adapt to change without knowing why you're doing something. You can be told what to do, you can be told when to do it, you can even be told how to do it. It won't help you if you need to change if you don't know why. As Apple and Amazon have proven, and because I used to work in the communications area, I'm quite familiar with all this, the most valuable strategies for adaptation are the most unusual, the ones that it is most difficult to copy, the ones that can set your value apart. But they're hard to evaluate, those kinds of strategies. They're hard to convince a doubting market, and they're costly to maintain. They're things that are very difficult to sell to people. Nevertheless, in a circumstance where you're working for a new government, where you're needing to adapt to change, you've got to set your product apart. You've got to look like the kinds of approaches that you're prepared to offer are not just the old model, are variants, but important variants. And this question of hard to convince a doubting market it means you need to be continuously able to vary that presentation that you made, that ability to sell, in the light of the body language or the response that you're getting. The research into strategies, particularly the research that I'm attracted to, for example, I put up Harvard Business Review, says in order to solve these kinds of selling processes, you have really only two options. You can release the strategic information that you have, that is, you can tell people your natural advantages, you can be upfront and open. This is very dangerous in a competitive market, but in the public sector it's quite plausible. People are impressed by your wider knowledge. They're impressed by the fact that you can offer this new information. The other alternative for a selling strategy, which is unique and different, is you need to find long-term and patient investors. In my view, there aren't too many long-term patient investors if you're talking about selling strategies with inside government. There are very few people who are prepared to give you multiple chances. It's not the wisest course of action. The wisest course of action between those two pathways to selling strategy is the one which says, release your strategic information. You need to be able to be ultra-transparent. The riskier the activity is, the better it is to be ultra-transparent. That's not advice about breaching confidentiality. It's about advice about getting things written down and signed off, even if that's after the event. Transparency is your friend because of these compliance mechanisms that now apply amongst us. And as I said, finding long-term investors, well, good luck with that, but I don't think there are too many out there anymore. Governments lack patience. Was that my 3-minute warning or my 1-minute warning? 2-minute warning, excellent. I've only got 2 slides to go. Implementation. So this is the stuff I like. This is the stuff I can help you with. If we get a chance to do Q&A, this is my long-term experience. Implementation of a strategy, the new agile public servant. Here are some real-life guidance rules. First, identify the real owner. What you are working with in developing your strategy, in developing your plan, and then in implementing it, it's very important to know who you're actually working for. And it's usually not the person you've been told. I mean, it could be, let's face it, the minister, but it's much more likely to be somebody a little closer to the action. You should always have a plan B, and I mean that really. People talk about having a plan B. Most of the time when I've done project delivery, I've actually written down and put in the bottom drawer a descriptor of what we'd do if we had the choice to change this. Okay, I'm delivering for what you said, and I've told you the risks associated with it, and you've authorised me to do these sort of things, but frankly, I have a plan B. And the value in plan B is in the next point. If failure looks likely, fail early. Now, fail early, I mean, identify that this isn't actually working. Being the first to say this isn't actually working is very important because you don't want to be the second. It means somebody dobbed you in. You're much better off being the person which says this is screwing up, than being the person who has to answer, you know, X told me this is screwing up. Decide a delivery model up front. Look, delivery models are tremendously important. In the new public sector, there are multiple ways of delivering services. We're used to having, it's my commentary about the hammer and the nail a bit earlier, we're used to having only one or two delivery models. I'm quite familiar with it because I've done a lot of infrastructure background. People talk about things like private-public partnerships and that sort of thing. I'm not going to tell you the delivery models unless you ask me them specifically afterwards, but there are multiple delivery models, and being prepared to use more than one of them is a very good sign of good strategic thinking according to the new impatient government that we'll all work for. My next point is, it's personal advice from me, never work for a committee. So if you go back up to the top point, when you identify the real owner, if the real owner of this, if you are working for a committee, I'd blow your brains out now or leave. I'd find somewhere else to go. Committees take no accountability. You know what I mean? If you're working for a committee and you're the leader of implementing this strategy, it's you, baby. Your head's on the block, not them. There is no accountability with committees. And finally, this is risk management, just written a different way. Identify early what can be solved and what can't be solved. Write it down and tell the owner. I can't solve this by implementing that. It starts to make Plan B look pretty good when you do it. Tend the garden every day. When you are running a strategy and implementing a strategy in the new work environment, there's no ability to be set and forget. Tend the garden every day is a positive way of saying, worry like hell about whether this is working and continuously consider your plan B. In my case, usually in the bottom drawer. I've removed it when I've left the job. I've taken it out, destroyed it. Actually, we've implemented plan B more than once in my experience. Tend the garden every day. The alternative to any of this, in my view, thank you very much.
This is a picture of a brain, not mine, and it's to reinforce the nature of agility and creativity is left and brain working together, and that's how we'll be smart. But in preparation for speaking with Yves Doss, I actually read a bit about what he would have told us earlier had he had the chance to fly to Australia, and some of this actually highlights the issues around rigidity of the public sector, clear division of labour, horizontal cooperation being a bit tricky at times, and then the trick about being able to work across boundaries in order to actually get shared outcomes and commitments to some of those things that committees actually craft for people like me. I think, Peter, I should have talked to you much longer and earlier than I did. But I suppose what it did in thinking about agility and effectiveness, actually I used this when I was in Centrelink in terms of looking at what is it that sticks people into a rut, they keep on doing something that has delivered value or performance for a while, but the world changes and then they end up doing the wrong action really well, at which point if they don't listen to feedback, they have the chance of failing, not them but their organisation or their services. Or they can move across to doing the right action badly at first, but through learning can actually pick up and get back into that cycle. So what does that sort of mean in terms of the tricky nature of complex issues that many in the public sector are having to deal with now? And why would the Secretaries Board at the Commonwealth Government have responded to a recommendation to pilot an innovation lab in Canberra? And some of the reasons were that the system is fragmented and costly, customer focus is sort of okay, conditional. In fact, when I spoke to Peter Harris as the Secretary in Communications, he said, we have really bright people and we get them to do the same old processes and we get the same old results, so something's broken here. And yet there's demand for more and better with less money. So the nature of these sorts of circumstances led to a number of governments actually picking up the notion of design thinking or looking at a third way, not just cause leads to effect and let's keep on ramming in those things. And sometimes you don't have to do the trade-off of price or performance or customer service or satisfaction versus optimisation. Many of the secretaries that I spoke to actually highlighted the 21st century challenges for all of us. They're not different in Australia to other parts of the world, but this issue around the fact that single departments or agencies aren't entirely responsible for absolutely everything is a pretty good predictor of you've got a wicked problem here, where it's a product of fragmentation and the fact that a rich social network of interests are involved, whether you like it or not. But it does your head in, and thank you to MC Escher, because solving a wicked problem essentially means you bring the social network into your work to try and both understand the nature of the way in which people and organisations are behaving, but also drawing on their thoughts and ideas as to how this can be resolved. So I was sort of thinking, and I'm not sure if I've nicked this from someone, but it seemed fairly useful that if we think we have a spectrum of choices between being a siloed agency or working in a collective sense, and this might pick up some of the keynote speakers this morning's sort of notion of evolution. And then we have stable conditions in which we operate right through to uncertainty and chaos. And perhaps in sort of looking at where our choices are, it's not one size fits all, but where there are simple known issues and stable conditions, that's where we can comfortably be a silo and be proud of it. But where there is a sort of a massive range of issues and perspectives, that's when we need the collective to operate and to bring in the sense of their ideas and their capacity to both co-design and co-produce. And if you get the other corners of those matrix, you're either going to be inefficient or bloody ineffective. And sometimes we end up doing that because we forget to actually open up our eyes to see what else is going on here. And this is a little bit of what Yves Doss would have told you, I'm sure, because his framework for strategic agility seemed to sort of match this sort of notion of strategic sensitisation, and as Peter said, share the information, because that's one thing that government and public sectors have and that other sectors can actually complement, and you can draw insights pretty amazingly from that. Collective commitment, in order to actually get things done when you actually stray outside that stable environment, you actually need others, the others who are influenced, impacted, or pretty useful along the way. And then that biggest challenge for all of us who actually work across government in horizontal roles, and I keep on signing up for them, access to resources and the fluidity of being able to share both the commitment but also the capacity to try things and deliver in areas of lack of clarity, I suppose. First mover governments around the world are picking up the sort of notion of design in government using innovation intermediaries such as DesignGov, but you can see that there are quite a number around the world. And what DesignGov has been doing in terms of those three elements of Yves Doss's framework, the collective commitment came from a board or a committee, the Secretary's Board, as well as the ATO. We've had amazing successes in being able to attract business organisations in the business community to work with us on a wicked problem, as well as drawing on the expertise internationally of academics and other design companies and players, as well as the Nudge unit. So the collective commitment to having a go, or as Chris Eccles has said, have a crack. And it picks up that issue around fail early, fail fast, and learn a lot as you try and work through what might actually happen. Resource fluidity, well, we managed to get just over $1 million to actually conduct a pilot, but it took a long time, and we applied a prospectus notion to actually encourage government agencies to put some money or people into the projects. And of course, the strategic orientation has been really focusing in the white space between policies, programs and portfolios. I'm just going to quickly dive through really the example I was going to use, because that doesn't allow for the 10 minutes. And until I get to this point, where through the design project that we are still running, we're now at a point of coming from a very general type of problem, how might we dramatically improve business and government interactions, to looking at how might we actually make it easier for businesses to navigate government, to be consulted in terms of things that actually matter to them, that can add value, that can be treated in terms of a service culture, be problem solving together, work with me to unravel problems. And there's one other one, emerging issues detection, which lines up very closely with ISDOS's strategic sensitisation, sharing issues that are unravelling, so that by a collective capture there might be some anticipation of what the future could bring. We're using things like crowd support to help for businesses, to help businesses navigate government, and I heard that. And things, it's been really amazing. We've had 60 businesses work with us in a really collaborative, keen way to try and solve these problems, along with the people from the public sector. So this stuff works, and so therefore Mission Possible is possible as long as that sort of genuineness, openness, and also the ability to experiment. And I think that's the biggest challenge, especially as it was the bottom of Peter's first slide, I think, in terms of if you're going to take a risk and fail early. And I think that we almost have to do what the Finns have been doing, which is every year they have International Failure Day, where they parade all of their success stories and people who own their failures, because it's the only way they've been able to be successful. We've got a few lessons about being a startup in the white space, and it is about a clash of cultures and opportunities. Networks matter, I suppose, is the sort of the key learning here, and being able to be transparent and discuss learnings as you go. So have a look at the 59 blogs that we have generated, because it is a sort of a journey as you go. The key, I think, is fast failure and successful implementation, and actually, as Chris says, have a crack, but do it within the bounds of not magic and expectations, but a sort of a pretty clear understanding that what some of the things that we're doing currently now, we could do a whole lot better if we bring on board better techniques, including Ask Why 5 times, as well as some of the other more richer techniques to bring the outside world into the public sector for problem solving. Thank you.
I'd like to just talk for a couple of minutes around what I think are 5 real difficulties facing the Commonwealth public sector, facing the state public sectors at the moment, because I think with respect to, I put it to you in terms of agility and effectiveness of governance, the starting point may be we're part of the problem rather than part of the solution. So let me put them out there as a provocation while you're thinking about the questions you might like to ask of us. The first, I think, is we have over the last 10 years had a proliferation of programs and policies and structures, and the proliferation has led to less agility and more rigidity, because it's harder and harder to be very flexible if you have more and more things you're trying to manage. And we've done some work of how many programs we've seen across government departments over the last 5 years, and there's been a mad proliferation, which we would argue makes agility more and more difficult. First point. Second point is we have had an inclination in government to assume a particular solution is right in all circumstances. So we had a love affair with joined-up government for some time. Now we have a love affair with citizen-centric government. And the argument I put to you around effectiveness and agility is that we need to think much more about fit for purpose rather than having these big fads. And I think it resonates with Peter Harris's points about let's learn and adapt as we go along rather than adopting particular approaches. Number 3, and I see this whenever we work with the private sector or the not-for-profit sector, is it's very difficult for governments to keep their hands off things and let either the community sector or the private sector get on and deliver things. So if you think about governance not just as the work of government, but the way we make decisions in society, there is a big trend across many of the governments in Australia now to delegate a lot more authority and accountability either to the next level of government, Commonwealth to state, and it'll be interesting to see where the Commission of Audit comes out on this, or from state to local providers. And I think for the Commonwealth public servants in the room, this represents a very major challenge for your cultures, which have had an inclination to say, because we've got to make people accountable for taxpayers' money, we need to set much more rigid and compliant accountability mechanisms that we have at the moment. 4th, and I think we should be honest about this, you can't be agile and effective if you go for quantity and not quality of people. And I would argue, and I could quote to you from any number of senior public servants, they have a heck of a lot of people, but they don't have the quality they're looking for. And I would argue we should get serious about moving on quality and perhaps giving way on quantity. And the 5th final point I'd make is it's very difficult to be agile and effective if you don't have a budget reinforces performance. And at least in some governments at the moment, we have budget processes that do not reinforce performance, that do not give rewards for success. And I think we should have another think about that. So 5, I think, practical challenges that represent real barriers to agility and effectiveness in governance.
I'd like to hear a little bit more, particularly from Peter, but also from Jane, about putting your information in the public domain or sharing the information, particularly at the ideas development stage of a policy or solutions to an issue. As the public servant, it's very challenging sometimes to do that without the political cover from a minister. Governments want to say what their policy is rather than say we're trying to work out the answer. So perhaps if you could reflect a little bit on how you might put some of those innovative strategy type ideas in the public domain, but manage the political risk while you're doing that.
So I can start with that. Let's put this into 2 levels. What leaders can do and what people who aren't leaders but are effectively having to run the delivery of something can do. I want to start with the leaders because they bear the bigger responsibility here. So I'm on the public record in multiple places since I've been doing this job, but prior to that as well, but I get more attention doing this job, in saying one of the great weaknesses of the public sector is that permission to take risks is not readily available anymore. And that's permission from the top. That's a job for the head of the department, the head of the public sector, and the minister responsible to create. And I don't expect the minister to do anything about creating that, which means the other 2 are really going to have to take ultimate responsibility for that permission to take risks. You know, I guess one thing, it's easy for me to say this, but I've tried to live it where I've run agencies, and I've tried to recommend it as strongly as I can to people who've been heads of the public sector where I've worked, and I think it's tremendously important in the current environment. So responsibility starts with leaders, but shoveling it down now to people who have to actually run and implement things, some practical versions of this. So I try and publish in the annual report, and I encourage the areas in the department to publish in the annual report of the things I plan to do. Now, we all know historically, Simon Ash is sitting in this audience somewhere, I can't see you, Simon, but Simon will know what I'm talking about because I did this at the Department of Communications. So we know the annual report's meant to be about last year. It doesn't matter. You can put things in the annual report that are a little bit about what you're about to do. And the great thing about an annual report is you're examined at estimates about that, and people therefore sometimes will ask you to talk about it in an environment where, as a public servant, I mean, you're obliged to answer the question. And I've done this. I've answered the question. It happens to be in the annual report. I got a question on it, so I expose a little about what we're doing and why we're thinking of doing this. And I've encouraged people who are running the more difficult of strategies to take those sort of opportunities. And then I'll let Jane have a go in a sec, but social media. So all of us in our departments now have social media management policies. I reckon if you look at them, quite a lot of them are about the rules. Ours were in the communications department more about the opportunities. I wanted every division to have run a wiki or the equivalent of that on a policy issue where, again, you weren't the person writing the crazy stuff. You were the person who put the intent or the plan or something out there and harvested the opinions, and you're curating a bit of this, but you know, it's a somewhat safe way of having ideas exposed. And the best thing in those sorts of circumstances for me is, you note both of them are what I would call written, as in there is some recordable version of this. And as public service people are afraid today about the written stuff because it's often held against you, and I understand that, and I'm not saying that's not smart behaviour, you should be afraid of it, but you can use it as well. So where it's written down and we've agreed to do something, that's your accountability record. Hang on, we agreed to do this. So I'm now switching from those two examples I gave of how to do things publicly, but there are versions of that. And the social media one in particular does apply to departments. Everybody wants to be playing in social media now. You have a chance to utilise this to give yourselves the benefit of transparency. Jane, you.
Thanks. There are a number of things I'll just quickly say. The New Zealanders actually did a wiki a long time ago that actually started this conversation with the community around through wikis and town hall meetings on their road safety policy. And that actually highlighted to the Minister of State, who was also the Road Transport Minister, that she didn't have to retail a government policy back out to the community. In fact, she could wholesale it back into Cabinet with the confidence that she had the input on an active way over a 6-month period as to what the community wanted in terms of that particular policy area. In the consultation relationship between government and the citizens or businesses, the feedback that we've received is that people can be quite concerned about the sort of consultation that they get involved in, and they would rather be part of an active area that has meaning back into government or their community, and that there are ways of actually channeling that and or focusing on it, but it certainly requires a conversation with the owner of the consultation. We've used an ideas platform that's a cloud service that only took us sort of a minute to turn on, as long as we'd paid our sort of monthly fee. And what that highlighted to me, because we were looking for feedback both through a whole range of third parties as well as direct business feedback, is that the behaviour is still fairly immature in terms of the willingness and comfort of people to actually give over issues and ideas, but I suspect that that will grow with experience. And I think too, this whole notion of open government, open data that I was involved with in the Victorian government for a long time, trying to sort of just get some of the standard government public sector data shared between public sector agencies, let alone the community, well before Mr. Obama had the idea, has shown that with those sorts of things you can start small in a fairly uninflammable way, and you build up behaviours and experiences and expectations, and that now look at what's happening in terms of that open data now actually feeding new companies, entrepreneurs and mechanisms. So I suppose if we look at that, that actually gives a level of comfort that this won't necessarily go off the rails. Some politicians as well as leaders will be complimented for this, and you can just sort of see what the open data movement is now doing across the world. So this too will come, I suspect.
Okay, we've got time for one more question for Peter before he dashes. So if you've got the red light, please make sure it's a question for Peter, otherwise we'll pass the red light to someone else. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, Colin Radford from Deloitte. Thanks, Peter and Jane and Tim. You both touched on the notion of failing quickly. How do we increase the tolerance for failure, or the public's acceptance, and particularly parts of the media, that failure is a necessary part of the prototyping process, particularly in design, and that it's actually, failure is an investment of taxpayers' dollars in getting it right? How do we shift that public perception?
Yeah, it's an almost impossible task viewed through any short-term, do this or do that kind of thing. There is, however, value in our better communication of risks up front. It goes to my transparency point again. The better public communication of the risks up front, which of course governments hate you doing. They hate you suggesting for a second that there's a risk with something that you're responsible for implementing. But that's the time to, sort of gird the loins and bite the bullet and, put on the concrete helmet and everything else. This is the bit that protects you later on. So transparency that there are risks, that I think I had up on the slide, that not all risks are manageable. And that transparency ultimately coming in, again, a form of public communication. Over time, that's going to retrain a bit of the media. It's not going to retrain the Daily Telegraph. It's not going to retrain the Herald Sun. But it will, I think, give you the greatest chance for convincing the sensible commentary that having a go at this and learning from the experience, particularly because we didn't overinvest and now we have Plan B, and it gives you a chance to go on. It's not, though, Colin, you're right, I don't have a simple, here's a guide for 5 or 6 things, but I do think that's one of the things that over time will be important.
Can I now just excuse Peter while we continue?
Thank you very much, and I'm sorry
answers.
for shooting out. My apologies.
Thank you, Peter.
It's a good question. I mean, how do you introduce prototyping into a culture and a style of organisation that, as one of my colleagues has described it, desktop perfectionism, that you get to a point where the only prototypes you have are drafts of something and of briefs, and yet what we have to do is try and sort of avoid that promise of perfect first out, rather than, as some wise person has said, evolve to perfection. I think some of it is what we do. We sort of try and promise through a business case that the whole thing is perfect and that we've worked it all out and that it'll go ahead according to plan, budget, time, etc. So we almost hurt ourselves as soon as we start. The fact that I think Chris Eccles today described 2 approaches to looking at sexual assault of Indigenous children. That's 2 prototypes. There are no promises, there's no announceables really, and I think that's part of that old environment that really hurts us trying to explore. One of the things around prototypes is the more crude and crappy, whatever the right term is, unfinished that things look like, feel like, are like, they're more likely you're going to engage broader community to help you make it better, and that there can be no expectation that this is a ribbon-cutting experience. I think the Nudge people from the UK have also highlighted that when they were trying to get their various Prime Minister and ministers involved in prototyping or randomised control trials, the minister said, yes, I'd like to try that out in some regional part of England. And they said, well, just remember, Minister, doing it once you could get that good feeling. Doing it 5 times you can get even a bigger understanding of what will work and what won't. So some of that is about educating too. So I don't think there are any clear answers, but certainly we can't continue to hurt ourselves by making promises and then saying that the leaders or the ministers don't like us mucking up. We need to actually recreate the conversation about how we pursue some of these initiatives.
Good. Thanks, John. Next question, please.
I'm good to go down here. Here I am.
Yes.
Dan Butler, I manage a program called Change in South Australia, which is not surprisingly in South Australia. It's a cultural change program for the whole of government. We realised very early on that if we were going to target primarily the executive cohort and chief executives, we'd be looking at roughly a little under 600 people in a sector with 100,000 and 83,000 of those being FTEs. Whereas if we focused on middle management, it would be roughly around 30,000 to 32,000. What we've sort of found is that in a way we're reimagining the role of middle managers and what some of their skills need to be to manage agility and effectiveness and ongoing change and ongoing evolution. I'm wondering what, particularly in light of, Tim, your comments about quality over quantity and indeed, Jane, your experience in design gov and the role of design in the professional life of a manager. What do you see as being some of those core skills? Do you see the role of managers as changing over the next 5-10 years?
I think I'd start by saying I'm not sure the question's answerable, in that I think government is so heterogeneous that saying that there's one set of skills that's required in 5 to 10 years underplays the diversity of the sector, and I think it's diverse in two ways. I can't think of a private sector organisation that would provide the range of services that government provides. It would not be successful in a competitive marketplace because it's such a diverse set of activities: education, health, prisons, transport, etc., etc. So I've always found the argument which says there's a common set of public sector skills somewhat implausible. There may be a common set of policy making skills, because that's the other complexity or diversity. You have policy people, you have program people, you have regulatory people, you have service delivery people, etc., etc. So my argument is we've got to think about the role of government in a far more diverse way than we have historically. And if we are going to have major cultural change programs such as the one, Dan, you're working on, I think we should have a relatively modest set of outcomes, because changing 30,000 people and changing 100,000 people in a very diverse sector is an extraordinary ask. With respect to the skills that managers need, I'm going to let Jane answer that one, because I just think if the skills I want in my prison officers is quite different from the skills I want in my policymaker in DPC.
And Sue and I used to work with prison officers and prison managers. We probably should invite you too to answer your own question. I have seen with the volume and material that the design community now brings into the management area, and for those of you who aren't aware, the business schools are actually starting to pick up design thinking as a means of the management sort of approach, moving beyond the scientific to actually be more embracing of ideas and creativity, and then sort of looking at what's going to work. I think that that sort of issue that has continually been reinforced since I've been doing the design gov job, but I think is also what Peter Harris mentioned to me when I started. We have these bright youngsters turn up, and within about 18 months we've made them beige, and they all know how to actually, I think I'm paraphrasing him, but I'm sure he'd agree, they all know how to produce a lovely brief, a good draft policy, but it looks like the last one with some of the words changed. So what do you do to actually give permission? You create the environment within which they actually feel that some of their ideas outside the square can actually be embraced, and that they don't have to be perfect first time, and find that sandpit to work in, that they can have some of the techniques that are readily available, but then to sort of apply it, not in the mission critical work, but in some of the sort of the more expansive opportunities that aren't going to hurt the government or hurt their careers or something, but let's actually tease this out. I think that it's pretty clear that a number of corporations around the world are starting to pick up these techniques because they've got scientifically driven executives and managers who know how to actually look at some balance sheets but actually don't know how to get the best out of their staff or their relationships with their customers or broader stakeholders. So that's where I think design thinking can come in, and certainly the New South Wales government's now training up, along with a whole lot of other techniques, their SES. So as a plug for design thinking, and there's a few good books, and have a look at our website because there's techniques that you can find too. But I think also it's going to be a hard struggle for managers and for the executives that are left, where the demands are certainly keeping what we have been doing in some respects, but then commissioning, outsourcing, going through those elements, and then doing something even more and better. So I think that issue around agility is agility of the mind as well as agility of the organisation and capacity of the leaders to embrace it and not to feel that they have to control everything and their staff, and that they can ask why without thinking that they're going to be considered stupid, because I've found it's a really good technique to actually invite people to tell you what they really think. What do you think?
Dan, if I could add one thing. If I look at the trends that I'm seeing across the public economy, the whole idea of working much more through others, whether it be private, not-for-profit or other parts of government, seems to be the big trend, which means that the skills that are required to do that, collaboration, contract management, commissioning, etc., they would seem to be something that it's not quite a revisiting of the 90s, but it's the next generation of that that we appear to be seeing. And it looks like it will run for another 5 to 10 years. Beyond that, I'm not sure. Other questions, please? It's really hard to see the red light. Are people pushing the button that's not working, or not pushing the button? Have we got one? Yes? I can't see it.
Hi.
Hello, how are you? Yes.
Daniel Zeta from the Department of Human Services. Tim, you mentioned in the points you raised at the start that or what you saw as the problem of government accumulating programs becoming more complex. I just wanted to put it to you, I don't necessarily believe this myself, but do you think that's just a consequence of a more complex society, an inevitable complex of the modern age, that the government is inevitably going to be involved in more things and embarking on more programs, etc.?
It's hard to know, Daniel, whether it's a policy challenge or a political challenge, but we've looked at one particular department where there's been a massive proliferation of programs in response, it would be argued, to the greater complexity of society. And if you look at any individual program, it looks like it makes lots of good sense. It's got a real program logic to it. Here's the challenge, here's why we think this will work, and here's the outcomes we expect. And so if you to evaluate any individual program, you'd say this looks like a good investment. And then when you step back and say we have 50 programs, and of our 50 programs, any 20 could be affecting the same group of citizens, and you start to say, is this effective? Because this is the approach that government is taking. Government doesn't work through individual programs, it's the collective of programs. And then you start to say, I'm not sure this is the right way for government to participate and contribute to and enhance the prosperity and outcomes for society. So I'm not convinced that more complexity means more programs or more government involvement. I mean, if you look at the way free market economies run, they don't run through lots and lots and lots of programs. They run through a small number of ideas and a lot of people being able to pursue their own particular goals and ends. Now, I think the idea that people are now talking about in terms of a public sector economy and commissioning and the like is starting to say there have to be many ways by which we can achieve our outcomes, and simply building more and more programs may not be the right way to do it. And I think for the people from the Commonwealth Government, there's been a real temptation to solve more and more problems for us, and it's not clear on reflection that we're achieving the outcomes we're looking for. I think it's a huge policy challenge for us to think through, and a huge organisational challenge as a result. Is there another red light?
Can I just, Tim
Yes.
and I are on a committee about looking at the future of the public sector, based in Melbourne University, and there was a comment made at one of our meetings that the business model of the public sector is broken, and in that it hasn't changed very much since the 19th century, and the sort of now the conversation is are programs and sort of established structures as we know them part of the problem, or what else has to change in order for that business model to be more familiar and responsive to some of the disruptive influences in our environment, particularly things like this, and that where control and information is actually going to be more in the pocket of individuals and their connectors than held in massive repositories and servers in Belconnen or something, or Bruce. So, that's something for us all to actually test, because things like programs have become very organised and made more efficient. The question is it in that 2x2 that I put up, are we doing the wrong thing really well?
Can I just, if you can wave to us when you get the red light, but can I make one other point while the red light's, it's there? Great,
Yep.
Thank you. Good.
Hi, my name's Ali Khan. I'm from the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. I recently found out that I qualified to be a young professional. I'm very proud about that. So I'll be attending the Young Professional Breakfast tomorrow morning. But on that topic of being young and a professional, does the panel have any advice on how us very young professionals can proactively seek agility in our careers in the public service, and also bring about agility within?
You must be the one who was hoping for the lights to come up so we could see how young and professional you were looking. It's interesting if you talk to secretaries and deputy secretaries and they say what are they looking for in their public servants, they are looking for people who've done a range of jobs. So I think the first thing I would say is do plan a career that takes you across several departments and moves you between policy and service delivery and regulation if possible, so you have the breadth of roles that will enable you to be a very successful senior public servant. I think you need to be careful though that you don't move every year and never achieve anything, but just get to admire each problem and then move on before it catches up with you, which is what happens in some organisations and indeed some parts of the public sector. The second thing I would say is I'm with Peter Harris very strongly in the sense that I think there's a lot more opportunity for you to be agile with your branches, with your units, with your divisions than is commonly assumed to be the case. And the most successful public servants I've seen have always assumed that they should do a great job and the rules help them, and sometimes the rules don't help them and they move on without outrageously breaching the rules. There are some rules that are absolutely critical and other rules which are guidelines, and they're much more driven by the outcomes than being trapped by the guidelines. And I think there's a lot of us sometimes use the guidelines or our boss or our boss's boss as an excuse for not getting on and creating the outcomes that we should be creating. And Peter, I think, told a fabulous story of courage with risk. And You've got to be very careful how you manage the big risks, but gee, the small risks, get on and take all of them because you'll learn a lot from the process.
I think that there are a lot of opportunities to connect with people beyond your nice Taylorist sort of branch these days that can expose you to other ideas and what others are doing, and that can be just like Eve Doss's framework, be sensitive and connected to others in order to actually bring more value into the roles that you're performing at the time. I suppose I used to, last century when I was looking for lots of different jobs, I'd look for the position, and then I found that in fact you're actually more likely to be effective and capable if you're actually working with great people. So in terms of your sussing out opportunities to actually be clear about what their motivations and interests are, and given that the woman's in the audience, one of the best interviews I ever did of a chief executive when we were looking at the remuneration levels of executives in South Australia, everyone said that their job as a chief executive was to do what the government wanted and bring the budget in on time. And what Sue Varden said was to create an environment within which the people that she worked with could give 110%. And that still brings shivers to my spine, because that's what you want to do. You want to do the best you possibly can, and you have to have others to help you.
Next question, please. While it's coming, and if you'll wave your hand, this might seem prosaic, but I think it's an example of where we get ourselves into inagile and ineffective governance. If you think about the budget process in government, where you always have an efficiency dividend of 1%, 1%, 1.5%, 2%, and then of course you bid back into government with your great new ideas, what we actually generate, I think, is a proliferation of programs and products. And we make our business more complex over time. And this is why I think it's not just about the attitudes we bring to our work, but there are important questions about the way we design the governance system, which will shape how agile we are. And my argument would be some of the things that we have designed in the governance system, such as the budget process, where we're constantly driving efficiencies and then generating the incentive for departments to bid back in, creates less agility and makes it less effective over time than would otherwise be the case. People get bored when I talk about that, but I think if we can't sort out those base things, then we'll spend a lot of time in rhetoric and not a lot of time in agility. We have another question in the audience, please.
Yep,
yes, we do. Thank you.
Susan Bell from Department of Infrastructure and Regional Development. We mentioned transparency, and you mentioned policy, program, and then outputs. Often we're talking to the community about our programs, and we're very often not talking to them about our policy intent, and we're often not talking about outputs either. We used to have ministers promise in 10 years we'd do X or Y, and they've all been often burnt trying to meet those targets. What would you think we could do more to get that out there in the community and be a bit more transparent about it?
That's a really good question, Susan. I've had first go a couple of times now, so I'm going to let Jane have first go, if you want to.
No, I'm still back on the question. You go first,
Okay.
I think.
Susan, I agree that not only do we have citizens who are interested in programs because they're a set of stakeholders who have a real interest in that particular program, but as often as not we have politicians who are interested in inputs because they can tell the story of an input to society, to citizens, to voters, whereas it's much harder to tell a story of outputs or outcomes. So it's much better, we'll put another 100 police on the street, we'll put another $1 billion into defence, we'll do this, that and the other. And so I think the challenge will always be there because that's an easy story to tell. I think the challenge for public servants is to be able to articulate for politicians and for citizens more clearly, here's the benefit that we'll get from this, and think very much about benefits rather than inputs. And I think the more we think about how we empower local providers, companies, etc., to provide the services, then the more we can think about benefits and outputs rather than inputs and programs. But I find myself it to be an inadequate answer, because the dilemma of what citizens are looking for, who are particularly attached to a particular program, and the dilemma of politicians needing to win the support of the citizenry, and inputs is the easiest story to tell, makes it, I think, an ongoing battle.
And thank you for taking that. My only thought at them, after conducting research with businesses who actually don't understand the language that people in government use, or what we put on our websites, or what we put in our posters or pamphlets, certainly simple communication, but actually understand that some people go onto Google just to find out how to ask a question. They join LinkedIn groups just to find out how to construct a question that might give them the opportunity to get an answer, or someone to answer their questions. So definitely the sort of public English sort of notions and of simple communications, and there's sort of the fact that there are companies in the business community that exist to package and translate our government lingo or public sector lingo in order that they can communicate requirements back from businesses. So just imagine what the poor citizens do. I think too that we fail to take advantage of the stories that are available to us in terms of people's experiences, or even scenarios as to what might happen. And that's clearly becoming more useful in terms of making a connection between a government program or a service and what people can experience or expect. So sometimes the sort of the fairly basic things can make a big difference, which then creates that relationship, or at least the ability to understand where each group's coming from.
Okay, I think we have a final question. I do see the red light.
Trevor Melksham, Department of Infrastructure and Regional Development as well. I want to take issue with these senior leaders that say they have quantity and not quality. I've only been in public service since 2009, and what I've seen is a hell of a lot of quality. There's good skills, there's good capabilities, just not enough people to do the jobs that keep getting loaded upon them. So I think those leaders are out of touch and need to get out of the way and let us get on with our work.
Okay, good. I'll pass on those thoughts. I would observe, just to push this back and forwards a bit, if you look at the numbers of public servants between sort of the mid-90s or even 2000 and now, we have a lot more quantity. We probably have the same quality, but we have a lot more quantity. So somehow governments are just asking us to do a lot more. And so the challenge might be, do governments need to be as activist as they are? And that's a decision that we make as a citizenry every 3 years when we vote. If that's the case, then perhaps we do need the quantity. But as a society, we will keep asking ourselves, and clearly this government's asking itself, and if you look at the governments around the country, every time there's an election, they ask themselves, what's the quantity that we're prepared to engage in order that people feel that they pay their taxes at a reasonable level. Now that takes us into a political debate. But that's one of the constant challenges that I think senior leaders are asking themselves is, how do we meet the set of demands government's putting on us and meet the budget that they've given us?